So yesterday we discussed about web table checkpoint, right? How do we do the web table validations and all? How do we retrieve the data and then how we validate? How do we deal with the objects and all? So today what we do is we will understand the database checkpoint. How normally we can validate the database in UFT, okay? And we need to understand in two ways. How can we use inbuilt checkpoint, and then how can we use scripting? What kind of programming we use to validate the database and all. Okay, so we may not be able to see all types of databases, but the process will be same for almost all the databases, whatever the process we see. We will be discussing about SQL Server. Okay, we have SQL Server 2012 version and we will be validating on that. But today we will be seeing the basic queries, but going forward we may need to see a lot of queries and all. Okay, so since there is a little problem in the database, I will not be able to show the all kinds of queries, but we will see the basic queries now. Okay, and but scripting will be same throughout. Okay, so now when you want to validate the database, the first question you get is, why do we need to validate the database? That is the first question always, right? So normally why do we validate the database? See, whenever we are using any application, we provide a lot of inputs and we do the changes, we store a lot of records or users or many things, a lot of information will be adding and will be updating many things. So those data should be updated permanently, and next time whenever we search, then the updated data should be displayed. Most of the times, in some of the applications what happens is, you might be having 20 fields in your application and then you have entered all the details. Okay, then when you enter all the details in the application and when you click on save, and what happens, that user is saved successfully or record updated successfully, something that you get. And when you try to search for that particular record, after that, once you save it, after some time when you search, it may not be able to retrieve all the information that what you have entered. It will retrieve only some information. Then you may get error saying that, okay, unable to retrieve this information, or this information was not found, something like that. You will be getting the errors. The reason because user is getting saved or record is getting saved, whatever the record that you have created, but not all the details are getting saved. Some of the details were not being saved. Okay, it could be the reason because in the database the query might be wrong here. So there are 20 fields, so 20 in the UI, so 20 fields must be there in the database also, maybe not in one table, maybe in multiple tables. Okay, different tables. All 20 fields must be updated in the database. That means all the information need to be updated. But by mistake they might have created only 15 fields, not 20 fields. So only those 15 fields will be updated. So 5 fields data will be missed out. So when you try to search for that particular data, then it may not display. That's the problem. So to make sure that all the data is being saved properly in the database, we do the database validation. That's a basic thing. Okay, now when we are doing manual testing, this is essential. It's a mandatory. You do the database testing. Then do we do the same thing in automation also? Of course you have to do. Whatever the manual test case says, you must have to do the same validation in the database also, in automation also. Now, okay, how do we do that validation through the data automation? Okay, so we are using UFT, and how do we validate the database using UFT? So to validate the database using UFT, you have two ways. One is you can use inbuilt checkpoint of the tool, database checkpoint. Similarly, you can use scripting part. Okay, we have seen some basic scripting in VBScript already, but same kind of script that we are going to use again now. Okay, so let's understand now. First, okay, the database, what database we have, and then we will have the validation point here. So we have SQL Server 2012. Okay, SQL Server 2012 database. And when you want to validate manually, or when you want to run the SQL queries manually, then usually when you are using SQL Server, you get something called SQL Server Management Studio. SQL Server Management Studio. So So this comes from Microsoft again, and same SQL Server also comes from Microsoft, and you can download this for free. Okay, so in SQL Server Management Studio, we will connect to from Management Studio. We connect to the SQL Server, and we can see all the databases whatever are available in the server, whatever we have connected. Then we can create the queries, we can write all the queries, SQL queries and all, and then we can run them and we can see the output, everything. Okay, so from the SQL Server Management Studio, that is for manual. Okay, and when it is automation, you don't need to use this kind of editors. You write the queries internally. We use something called drivers and providers. We are going to see next. Okay, I just opened the SQL Server Management Studio to see our database and to run some basic query manually and to see the output. Okay, so let me launch it. So it's launching. Okay, normally when it is SQL Server, right? SQL Server has got two types of authentications. Remember, for Oracle and all, it's different, but SQL Server has got two types of authentications. One is Windows authentication and second one is server authentication. Okay, so when you log in as a Windows user, then it will be a administrator by default. Administrator will get logged into the application, so that you will be having complete control on the database. And also when you say Windows authentication, you don't need to provide the username and password, because the user who logged into the Windows currently, he is authorized for the server whatever is installed in the system. Usually we do the Windows authentication when you have connected to the host, nothing but the system, wherever that server is installed. But if you are logging into the SQL Server from a client, that means from a different system, server is here but you are logging in from a different system, then that time you may need to use server authentication. Now if you look at that, as soon as I launch the Management Studio, it is asking for type of the server. Obviously it is database engine, and the name of the server. Okay, so server name, when you are installing SQL Server or when SQL Server is installed, they provide the name. Whoever is installing SQL Server, they provide the instance name. That is the server instance, you call it as. Then normally server instance name will be like this: host name, SYS is the name of the host here, slash server name. Server name has given a Satvatek here. Okay, and also if you look at that authentication, there are two types of authentications available here: Windows authentication and server authentication. Same thing you can provide in the script also. Okay, when you select Windows authentication, if you see that username and password are being disabled. The reason why, because when you are using Windows authentication, it will automatically take the username and password of the system, whoever logged in currently, system user. Okay, you don't need to provide username and password separately. Okay, but when you are using server authentication, then you must have to specify the username and password, which user you are logging in. There could be multiple users. SCA is the default user in the SQL Server. Okay, when you install the SQL Server, SCA username will be automatically created. You don't need to create it. Okay, but we also have got a separate user. Then you can say something called test user, and password I have given here for this user. I am giving the password and click on connect. Okay, so there is some problem. Login failed. No, sorry, the username is different here. So I have given as Satva user because test user is not available. So user is logged in. Okay, so but when you give a Windows authentication, then you don't need to provide the username and password. By default it will get login. Normally when it is Windows authentication, there won't be much restriction, like you can access everything. But when it is server authentication, then normally user ID and password will be created by the admin, server admin, and permissions can be restricted. Okay, so now let's say here I'll tell you, just let me open that Management Studio again. Just wait for a moment. Okay, so now what I am doing is I am logging in as SA. SA is nothing but admin user, I'm just logging in as an admin user, and now when you log in as an admin user, you can create the users. Okay, and if you see here, Satva user, one of the user here. Then for this user, admin can do the restrictions for all the users. He can create multiple users and all. Then he can specify what kind of roles that he can perform. So can we perform admin role, or only just a particular admin only, database admin or server admin or system admin, all this. Okay, then what and all the databases inside one server, you can have multiple databases. What and all the databases you can access, and what level of database it is. Like you can provide the access. All the tables can be accessed. Okay, or you can be owner of the tables. All those things. Okay. So then what kind of roles that you can perform on the database. Okay, all these roles. Then you can say we can grant the permissions, all those. Okay, so that means that whenever they create the user, then for that user they can restrict the permissions, depends on what type of user. Now let's take a project. When you take a project, there will be database administrators will be there, developers will be there, testers will be there, many people will be there. Whereas developer may not be able to create the table. Database administrator can do that. Database developer or tester may not be able to create. Developer can insert the data, and developer can update the data from a table. Also he can retrieve the data. But whereas tester can update the data but cannot insert the data, can update the data, or can retrieve the data from the database. So like this, it depends on the role that you are performing in your project. For your user ID, they will restrict the permissions like that. So when you are logging in with the server authentication, then certain permissions might not be available for you. Okay. Normally Windows authentication may not be shared with you, Windows credentials and all, because server will be installed in a different system, not in your system. You can do Windows authentication only when you logged into the Windows where the server is installed. Getting what I am saying here? Okay. Now this is how normally we can connect to the database. And now what I am doing is I am just running some basic query here. We don't have too many tables created as of now. I'll just have only one table created here. So something like student list. Execute, and there is only one row available. And now let me do one thing. So let me add 3 more or 4 more tables, so that it will be easy for us to validate the database. Okay. So what queries I am executing? Select queries and insert queries. Okay. Wait for some more time, you will learn all these queries. I will explain all this, what is mean by insert, what is mean by select, or what is mean by create table, all those. How do you create these tables and all, we will see. Okay. Execute it, and then I am just updating the tables. There are total of 4 rows. Okay. Now remember, what we have done is we have connected to the database. This is the database. Okay. So you can see here there are databases. This is the database, and all the tables will be there in the database. And then once you run the SQL query, you run the SQL query in the database normally, and whatever the data returned here, this is the data result. Okay. So whatever the data returned here, the group of this each row, whatever is returned, each row is called as a record. Normally in terms of database, each row whatever is returned by a SQL query, each row you call it as record. Okay. Now this group of records, including the column headers, this group of records you call it as record set object. Okay. So when you run the SQL query, whatever is returned here, that return type is record set, you call it as. What is meant by record set is nothing but group of records, whatever returned by SQL query. Each record is nothing but each row. There are 4 rows returned, nothing but 4 records it returned. Okay, all those 4 records where it returned in the record set. Whenever you run the SQL query creates a record set automatically and stores the data, or will pass the data, whatever the data returned from conditions, whatever you have used, that data will be passed to the record set automatically. Okay, so this is what you just need to remember for now. Okay, now what I will do is, we need to validate the database, but we are not doing manually, we need to do through automation. So as I told, we are using UFT. Okay, then through UFT, how do we validate the database? So as I told, there are two ways you can do. Earlier we discussed about this. 2 ways. One is by using inbuilt checkpoint, and second one is through script. First we will see the inbuilt checkpoint, and then we will go to the script. But usually we prefer to script only, because inbuilt checkpoint has got some limitations and all again. Okay, how do we do through inbuilt checkpoint? So if you want to do through inbuilt checkpoint, go to design and checkpoint, then you can see there is something called database checkpoint here. Design, checkpoint, database checkpoint. Now if you see that remaining checkpoints are disabled, database checkpoint is enabled. The reason why database checkpoint is enabled and not other checkpoints enabled here, why other checkpoints are disabled and why only database checkpoint is enabled, XML also enabled here. The reason why these checkpoints enabled, because these checkpoints whatever are enabled here may not directly connect to the database. You don't need to, application. You don't need to connect it to the application to access the database. If you see that we have opened the database without opening the application, right? But remaining checkpoints like standard checkpoint, text or text area, bitmap, accessibility, all those you insert on the application. When the application is up and running, we insert on the applications. So whenever you want to insert those checkpoints, connection has to be established with the application. Then only those checkpoints can be inserted. When the connection will be established with the application, when you are doing recording or running. But running anyway you cannot do any insertion or anything. During recording we insert the checkpoints, those checkpoints. But for database checkpoint, you don't need to connect to the application to access the database, right? So you don't need to connect it. So we have not opened any application to open the database. Without having the application, we can still connect it to the database. So that's the reason that checkpoint is enabled. Okay, so that means without connecting to the application, you can connect it to the database. It is a database independent from the application. Okay, now if you want to insert the checkpoint on the database, or if you want to validate the database, go to design, checkpoint and database checkpoint. Then it will display, as soon as you select that, it will display database query wizard. Then there are 2 options on top. If you see that there are 2 options. One is create query using Microsoft Query, which means that if you are not good at SQL queries, if you don't know SQL queries properly, so it will be difficult for you to write the SQL queries to validate the database. Obviously you have to write the SQL query, and then whatever the data returned by SQL query, you need to validate it. And if you say that no, okay, I don't know how to connect to the database through scripting, and I don't know how to write the SQL queries and all, no problem. What UFT does is, if you select the first option, instead of writing the SQL query, it will provide you the options, to select the database, which database you want to validate. Okay, there is something called driver and provider. You will understand slowly. You just need to select the provider. You select what type of validation that you are doing. Then as soon as you select the server, it will automatically display the database inside. When you select the database, it will automatically display the tables inside. When you select the table, it will automatically display the columns inside. You just select the columns, what columns you want to validate, click on OK. Data will be automatically retrieved. So you don't need to write the query at all when you are using the first option. But if you say that no, okay, that's fine, I know the query, I know how to connect to the database using programming, and I know how to write the SQL query, then I don't need to use the inbuilt option, retrieving the columns and all, because when you go by selection, just column selection and all, joins and all may not work properly, it will be difficult for you to create the joins and all, conditions and all. So that's the reason we write our own queries. Now if you know your query, what query need to be executed, you can select the second option here. What is that? Specify SQL statement manually. You select that particular option. When you select that option, it will ask you to enter the SQL query manually. Then click on next. So I have selected second option here. So specify SQL statement manually. When you select the second option here, what happens? It is asking for two options. You get two inputs here. One is correction string. Second one is SQL statement. Then one is connection string is nothing but here information about the server. Connection string will specify the information about the server, to which server and to which database you are connecting. So normally when you are connecting to the database using program also, maybe when you write VBScript or any other language in .NET or Java or any language whatever you use, whenever you want to connect to the database, this connection string is a mandatory. Okay, what we specify in the connection string is, one is there is something called a driver or something called a provider. So what is meant by this driver or provider is, normally these drivers are kind of supporting files or DLLs, which will make which will work as an interface, or which will work as a mediator, you can say, pure normal term if you use, mediator between your server and the script. Okay, the driver and provider does the same thing, but driver and provider does the same thing, but provider you can call it as a lightweight version. Provider is lightweight. There is no much difference between driver and provider. Okay, so for every type of database like Oracle database or SQL Server database or MS Office, like Excel also can be a database, or MS Access also can be a database. Okay, so for each database that whatever we have, there are different providers and different drivers that we do have. Different providers and different drivers that we do have. So it depends on the type of database that you are connecting. When you are connecting to SQL Server, you specify one provider name. If you are connecting to Oracle, you provide you have to give another provider name or driver name. When you are connecting to MS Office, MS Access or Excel, you need to provide a different provider and driver. Either one, either provider name or driver name, you can provide anything. And then once after you are providing the driver or provider information, then you need to provide the server information. What is the name of the server that you are trying to connect to? So when it is SQL Server, server name should be given like this: name of the system, in which system that server is installed, / name of the server. So you have to provide the server name. Next you need to provide name of the database. As I told that in one server we can have multiple databases. So you need to provide the database name, and then you need to provide the authentication information. Authentication in the sense user ID and password. Again, as I told, there are two types of authentications for SQL Server: Windows authentication or server authentication. Then you can specify Windows or server authentication. Then if you are using Windows authentication, you give one parameter, something called trusted_connection. Okay. So then you don't need to provide username and password. But when you are using server authentication, you have to give user ID and password. So what you are giving, what is the provider or driver that you want to use? Name of the server, name of the database, and credentials, user credentials. That's what the connection string is really made for. So connection string is nothing but what provider it has to use or what driver it has to use, what server you have to connect, what database that you need to connect, and then what user ID and what password that you need to use to connect to the database. Okay. Now we will discuss more about this connection string when we are discussing scripting part, when we are validating the database through scripting. But as of now, I have written the one provider already. Here I have written one provider already. So what I am doing is I am giving the provider here. User ID Sattva user, password test2047. And if you look at that database, I am using master database. I am connecting to Sattva Tech. Nothing but here it is. So you can see this is the server name. So this is the name of the server what I have given. And database is nothing but, you can see this is the master database. And username and password, whatever the user that I want to log in. I am using server authentication here. Okay, so I have already used, I have created this connection string, but while discussing scripting, I will explain you more about this. I have given connection string here, or you can also create the connection string. If you say that no, I don't know what provider I need to use, what driver that I need to use, then you can also create your own, but this takes little time. There's something called DSN, you need to create a data source name and all that you need to create, but that takes little time. As of now, let's leave it. Whenever we get the time, I will explain that. That is not too important for us now. Okay. So what you can do, there is something called the DSN, the data source name that you create, and you need to select the data source name. That data source contains the driver information, what driver you are using, what database, what server, what user ID and password, everything that DSN contains. Okay. So or else you can do one thing. You can also create the data sources here, where in the control panel, administrative tools and the ODBC, and then you can add the DSN here. So now this is the driver. When you are using DSN, maximum you select is driver only. It will ask you to give the server name and then name of the database, all those, but it is taking some extra time. But leave this for now. We will discuss about this little later. Okay. So that's the reason what I am doing is, instead of creating, I am writing manually. Okay. So instead of using tool help, I am writing manually. Then what you do is write the SQL query, whatever the query that you want to execute for database validation. So I have given connection string here. I have given SQL query and click on finish. Then you can see all the data is coming here. Database checkpoint, all the data. There were 4 rows, all 4 rows have come, whatever the rows. By default, all the rows cells have been selected to validate. Then you can select whatever the data that you want to validate. You can validate. Just think about one validation point here. Assume I just created one student, and I will say I need to select the first name of the student. First name of the student. Then which student? Student ID equals to STU004. Yeah, so I need to validate the first name of the student, but this I have inserted this data from UI, from the application, so data has been inserted in the database. Okay, forget about the UI now. Now I generated one query, says select star from student list where student ID equals to STU004. That means display all the data for the student ID STU004. That is what it is. Now I need to validate the column first name. First name must be tested. That is what I want. Okay. So what I am doing now is go to the database, database checkpoint, and then I am specifying manually provide this query, and the connection string you specify. Okay. specify and click on finish. Only one row has been displayed. Now what is your validation point? Validate the first name, right? So you don't need to select all the columns now. So what you do? Unselect remaining columns. Unselect remaining columns. Select only first name column here. Then you provide your expected. Then click on OK. So database checkpoint has been inserted. It's very simple. What you do is just go to the database checkpoint, you provide the connection string. But before that you select an option. Specify SQL statement manually. But I will come back to the other option also. But when I am connecting to the database, it is taking little time. Okay. So we I will use different database and then I will show you later, not now. Okay, fine. So what I have done here, I just inserted the database checkpoint and I have written my query. I have selected a column, what column need to be validated, and I have given the expected value there, and then I just inserted. So checkpoint has been inserted, and when you run the SQL query, when you run this checkpoint, what happens? Whatever the query that you have specified, right, it will execute that query and it will go to the column. It will go to the column, whatever the column in the database, whatever the column we have selected. Then whatever the data returned when the query is executed during runtime, it will execute that query during runtime. It will retrieve the data, and whatever the data returned from the database when it is executed, that data will be compared with the expected value, that whatever we have given. Expected value is test. So it will validate. Now it's executed. Let's see what's the result of this. So it's passed because it's first name of that particular student is test only. So expected value I have given as test. It is taking little time, just bear some time. This table, it will just show that it is passed, no much details and all. Okay, it just passed. Okay, now what happened is, after some time, somebody, what's the query? Update table. Is it update table? Student list set what is that? Student first name equals to, I'll just say Anand. Where stu id equal to stu004. Okay, so I just updated the first name. Now you can see first name has been updated. But in the checkpoint, what was the expected result I have given here? Sorry. When I inserted the checkpoint, expected value I had given as test. But now somebody updated the value for first name for that particular student. Now when the query is executed, whatever the query I have given, the first name will result as Anand because that is the latest name. But in the expected result, when I inserted the checkpoint, in the expected result I have given as test. So the expected name what I had given earlier, the actual name what exactly it is now in the database are mismatching. So obviously it should show as failed. Now let's see. So it will run that query again, retrieve the data, go to that first name column and take the expected value, takes the actual value, whatever is there in the database now, and compares it. And let's see what is the result. It's failed. The reason why it is failed, let's see here. Okay, so you can see it's failed here. Then if you want to compare, then you click on compare values and you can see that. What's the result? Expected value is test and actual value is on. Because we just updated after inserting the checkpoint, after giving my expected result, I changed the value in the database. So expected was something and actual is different thing here. So this is how you validate the database by using database checkpoint. So normally database checkpoint is used to validate the database, and then you need to specify the SQL query, you specify which database it is and all, then you select the columns, what columns that you want to validate, you provide the expected values. Then next time whenever you run the script, whatever the query that you have executed, it will run that query and retrieves the data and compares the data with the data what you have provided in the checkpoint. The same columns, whatever the columns you have selected, it will validate those columns with the data what you have provided in the checkpoint. Okay, so this is database checkpoint. But when you are using this database checkpoint, inbuilt checkpoint, there are certain limitations. Sometimes you don't deal with one table, you may need to deal with multiple tables and you need to use joins and all. And when you are using joins and all, then sometimes what happens, it may display one row or it may display multiple rows and all. So if new records are inserted, then if the record whatever I have selected, the record position may get changed, or that record may get deleted or anything. So that record may not be displayed in that row, whatever the row that we have selected. Okay, so in such cases, even though the data is there or data is not there, if the row number is changed and all, then checkpoint will fail. So a lot of limitations are there with the inbuilt checkpoint. So that's the reason we don't use inbuilt checkpoint at all. Then how do we do that? If we are not using inbuilt checkpoint, how do we do that? Then by using script. Okay, so we will write the program to validate the database. And how do we write the program? There are multiple steps we have to validate the database. Okay, so write down step by step here. Validating the database using script. Validating the database using script. So let me open this. Let me open a new file. Database validation. Let me change the font size. Okay, so step 1, initiate the database connection. Initiate the database connection. That's the first step. Okay, second step. Second step is define the connection string and open the database. You need to define the connection string and then you need to open the database. That is the second step. Third step is define the SQL query. You may define or you directly provide when you are executing. Okay. Fourth step is create a blank record set object create a blank record set object. That's a fourth step. Okay. Fifth step is open the record set by running the SQL query in the opened database. Whatever the database we have opened in the second step, in the database by running the SQL query, you open that record set, whatever you have created. That's a fifth step. Then sixth step is validate the data displayed in record set. You have to retrieve the data from record set. Remember, you retrieve the data from record set after running the query. After running the query, data will be coming into the record set and you validate from there. Next, seventh one is, once you are done with validations, close the record set object and database. Okay, so these are the steps that we perform to validate the database, to retrieve the values from database or to validate the database. Remember, these steps, these 7 steps are common across any of the database that you use. Maybe you are using, tomorrow you may use Oracle database in your project, or you may use SQL Server database, or you may have MS Access, or you may have Excel also. You may need to retrieve the data from Excel and all. Excel also can be treated as a database object, remember. Excel also can be treated as a database. So this same process you can also use for Excel, can be used for Access, can be used for SQL Server, can be used for Oracle, and maybe some other database also if you have anything. So the process will be same, but only thing is the content, like how you connect it to the database, may differ from one type to another type. For SQL Server you get some parameters, for Oracle you get some parameters, for MS Access or MS Office you get some other parameters in the connection string. And SQL query also may vary, obviously table names will vary from database to database, project to project, right? And data also will vary inside. So column names or table names and all will vary, so SQL query will be changed obviously from test case to test case or project to project. But when you take high level process, steps that what you perform, the steps are quite common. All the same 7 steps you will be performing everywhere. Now let's understand one by one step that whatever we have written here. Okay, one by one step, how do we perform each step? What's the first step here? So let me take this. Let me comment out the existing piece of code. First one is initiate the database connection. Initiate the database connection. That's the first thing. How do you initiate the database connection? We have to use something called create object, ADODB dot connection. The full form of ADODB is ActVex.object for database. ActVex data object for database. DB stands for database, ADO stands for ActVex data object. Okay. Then this initiation, whatever the initiation that you are doing, this initiation should be taken into a variable, so that whenever I want to use the database, I can take this. Okay. So what you have to do is say set ODB equals to create object ADODB dot connection. Okay. So you must have to initiate the database connection like this. Okay. Fine. This is the first step. What's the second step here? Define the connection string and open the database. again the connection string and open the database. How do we do it? Then you specify connection string like this. Whatever the database that you have initiated, then you say that the database object dot connection string equal to, then you need to provide those parameters in the connection string. So parameters, as I told, will vary based on type of the database that you are connecting, SQL Server or Oracle or anything. But the method is same, property is same, ODB dot connection string equal to, same way use, but the providers, parameters what you give, input what you give here will vary between the type of database. When you are using a SQL Server database, you use something called driver or provider. Okay, only one thing, not both. And then you have to specify the server name, and then you have to provide the database name. Three things: driver or provider, server name, database name, and authentication information. Windows or server. Windows means you give one parameter, something called trusted underscore connection. Server Windows authentication it is. Server authentication means you provide the user ID and password. That's for SQL Server. When you are using Oracle database, you provide driver or provider, but provider name or driver name will vary here. SQL Server, one driver name or provider name. Oracle, it's a different driver name or provider name. Then there is something called DSN you provide, data source name, but where this DSN will be created, not in the ODBC this time for Oracle. When you are when you want to connect to the SQL Oracle database, not SQL Server, Oracle database, you have to install Oracle client in your system. From which system you are connecting to Oracle database, you have to install something called Oracle client. Then only you will be able to connect from client to server, from this system to server. Inside this client folder, there will be one folder called admin. There will be one Oracle client folder. Once you install that, folder will be created. Inside that, there will be one folder called admin folder. Inside that, there will be one file called TNS names. .ORA. ORA stands for Oracle. File name also must be TNS names. Inside this TNS names, you provide the server information, how that server, what server it is, what host it is, what port you need to use, okay, what is the ID of that system. All these things you provide inside the TNS names. Then whatever you store, you can store information of multiple servers in one file. Each server information we associate with one variable. That variable is called as DSN this time. So what we do is, this DSN we create inside TNS names file, where the TNS names file will be in Oracle client folder. So take that TNS name, DNS name, that variable name, and provide that variable name in the script. So when you provide that variable name in your script, what happens is, it will go to the TNS names file automatically, retrieve the information of the server, whatever the information you have stored for this variable. Okay, you will see that Oracle database, as of now we don't have the Oracle database here, but I will get some other laptop and then I will show you. Okay, so wait for some more time, don't get confused here. Okay, so the way you connect to the Oracle is little different. I mean the connection string will be little different here, and user ID and password you need to provide. That's fine. But when you are providing, when you are using MS Office like MS Access file or MS Excel file, Excel or Access, anything, both are files. MS Access is like ACCDB extension or MDB, Microsoft Database, or Access Database, ACCDB it is. You have to provide the server name, driver name or provider name, anything is okay. And this time what you need to provide is the data source, something called data source. but data source is nothing but it's not server name or database name. Path of the file, because it is file actually. Excel or access are files normally. You just provide the absolute path of the file. Okay, this file is the database for me. Okay, so like this, connection string will vary, depends on the type of the database. We will see for all the databases one by one, but not immediately. So later part we will see, one by one, but it's important for us also. But as of now, since we are validating only the SQL Server, so I define only for SQL Server. Say connection string, I am giving the provider. Provider for SQL Server is SQL OLEDB. Okay, so provider for SQL Server is SQL OLEDB. Remember, this is very important. Okay, so they may ask you what's the provider name that you are using. Provider SQL OLEDB. Wait for some time, I will explain that. Okay, then next is you give server. Each parameter will be separated by semicolon. Each parameter and value will be one parameter and value, semicolon, second parameter and value. So you give the name of the server. Server name is this. So whatever the server that you are connecting to, here this is the server, and it could be a different server in your project. That's a server. Semicolon. Now inside server there will be database. So you say database equal to, give the name of the database. There are multiple databases available here. So you can see master is one database, model is one database, MSDB is one database, TempDB is one database, SatvaDB is another database. Now what I am doing is here master database. So what I have done, I have used provider, I have given server, I have given the database. Next, authentication information. Are you using Windows authentication or are you using server authentication here? So server authentication. First let's see Windows authentication, how do we give that, and then we use server authentication. Okay, so when you are using Windows authentication, you have to give parameter like this, trusted underscore connection equal to yes. That's it. If you give trusted underscore connection as yes, you are using Windows authentication. You don't need to give user ID and password. So if you are using Windows authentication to connect to the database, then you give last parameter as trusted underscore connection equal to yes. Then you don't need to provide user ID and password. But in case if you are using server authentication, not Windows authentication, then you must have to give the user ID and password. How do you do that? So user space ID it is, not user ID continuously, it will be user space ID. User ID equal to, so what is the user that we have created? So this is the user ID that we have created, semicolon password equal to, this is the password. That's it. That's a connection string. So this is connection string is nothing but you are just describing how it has to connect to the database, which database it has to connect to, in which server, which provider it should use when it is connecting. That's what it is. So this connection string will vary from one type of database to another type of database, and also one project to another project. So in another project, if you are using SQL Server, you can use the same provider. Provider will be same, but server name and database name, user ID and password will be changing. Obviously, project to project, server name will be changing, database name will be changing, and user ID and password also will be changing. Okay. Next, once you specify the connection string, you open the database. So that is what specifying the connection string and opening the database. Okay. So this is second step. You initiate the database connection, then you specify the connection string and open the database. Second step we are done. What's the third step here? Define SQL query. Then SQL query, you can just create one variable. You can use any variable name if you want, STR/SQL or something like that, and then you give the SQL query here. So this is the query that I need to execute. Just define the SQL query, whatever the query you need to execute. I just said as select star from student list where student ID equals to STU004, whatever the query that I need to execute. So this is third step. Then what's the fourth step? Create blank record set object. Create blank record set object. Then how do we create the record set object? You know what is meant by record set? I just told in the beginning. What is that? Group of records. Whenever you run the query, then it will load where the data will be displayed in the record set. Okay. So you may need to create the record set, but you can still do without creating it. As soon as you run the query, it will automatically create it. Okay, but I will explain that in detail again. Okay, so I will explain detailed database validation going forward. There are a lot of things that you may need to know. Again, what I am telling here is basics. Okay. Set OREC. OREC stands for O record set. You can give any variable name again. Create object. ADODB dot record set. So if you want to create a record set object, you say create object ADODB dot record set. So this method is used to create the record set object. Okay, so ADODB is a namespace there, library, and the record set is a class. Then next what you need to do is, once you create the record set object, you need to open the record set. What is the step? You need to open the record set by running that query and in the database, whatever is opened. How do you open that? You say OREC dot open. Then what is that? By running the SQL query, you specify the SQL query. OREC dot open space query, whatever the query it is, comma database, whatever the database it is. Right? Then next, validate the database. So when you are validating the database, you get lot of methods here. Various methods available. One is to check how many records returned. One is to check whether the cursor is at end of the record or beginning of the record. Some methods are to retrieve the data from a particular column. Some methods are to move the cursor between the records, to move to the next record or to move to the previous record or last record, or to move to specific number of records from the cursor position, all this. So all these methods that we may need to use to validate the database. Okay? But we may not see all the methods now. When I explain detailed database script, okay, then I will show you full complete methods, but we will see the basic validation as of now. Okay. So very first thing is here, as soon as I open the record set in that query, it will execute that query, whatever is there in the SQL. All the records whatever returned by that SQL query will be coming into ORC. First thing that what I should do is, I need to see whether any record is returned or not. There are two ways that you can check whether records have been returned or not. There is a method called, ORC dot, there is something called record count method. But this record count returns is, this record count returns how many records are there in the record set. But this doesn't work all the time. Before you use record count method, there is one setting that you need to do for the record set. One setting that you need to do for record set. That setting is something called cursor type. Cursor type. Okay, if the cursor type is set to 3, then only you can use this record count, otherwise it will not work. Default cursor type is 1. Normally default cursor type is 1 for the record set. What is that cursor type and all? Okay, again we will see it after some time. Okay, for now let it be. You can use record count when the cursor type is 3. This record count will return total number of records returned in the record set. So your validation will be like this. If record count is greater than 0, that means there are some records returned. If record count is less than or equal to 0, sometimes it may return -1. Less than or equal to 0, then that means there are no records returned. That's basic validation you do whether records have been returned or not. The other way is, there is something called EOF, something called end of file stream, equivalent to at end of stream in the notepad. What is at end of stream in the notepad? Checks whether the cursor is at end of the file or not. If the cursor is at end of the file, that means there are no further records. So whenever I open the record set, by default EOF should be false. That means EOF true means cursor is at the end of the record set. If records have been displayed, cursor will not be at end, cursor will be in the beginning. So EOF is used to check whether the cursor is at end of the record or end of the record set or not. Okay, by default EOF should be false. It should not be at end of the record set. By default it is at end of the record set, that means no records are there. Another way of checking whether any record is returned or not, we can use something called EOF. So what we do is, if EOF equal to false, then you write your script here to retrieve the data. Else, you write a message saying that reporter.report event and then fail it. For now I will use message box saying that no records returned with the query, something like that. Okay, if records are returned, what should you do? You need to validate the first name. So you need to retrieve the data from first name column. How do you do that? Oh, that record set dot, there is something called fields. Fields is nothing but columns. Fields of, what's the column name we have used? Student underscore first underscore name. Dot value. So that's how you retrieve the value from specific column. Record set dot fields of column name dot value. By default, it will retrieve from first row. Then you have to move to the next row, and then you can retrieve one by one if you want. Then you can say str actual first name equal to something like that. You provide. You give your expected name here. Str expected first name equal to, I'll say test. If use of trim of str expected first name equal to use of trim of str actual first name, then message box first name matched, else message box first name not matched, then I will display VBCRLF still expected first name. I'll just display both. So what I am doing now, if it is false, UIF is false, that means there is some record displayed. After, okay, if there is any record displayed, get the value from this column. Get the value from this column and store here. And expected name is stored here, and compare this expected name with the actual name. If both are matching, say it as matched. If not matching, then display that both are not matching. Normally, when you are doing automation testing, you write to log reporter.report event instead of using message box. You should not use message box, but only for display I am using message box here. Okay. Now this is how you validate the database. Now right now I am validating only from one column, but if you want to validate from multiple columns, you get the data from one by one column. Okay. Then this is how you validate the database. After that, what is the last step? Okay, this is the validation, right? This is sixth step. This is sixth step, and seventh step is you need to close the record set object, and then you need to close the to close the record set, you do it as close. That record set dot close, that database dot close. This is, make sure that you do this every time you close it, whatever you have opened. The reason, because every time you open the database odb.open, it will make one connection to the database. Then if you run your script for 10 times, 10 connections will be opened. If more connections are opened, then it will become very slow. System will become very slow, database will respond slow. So that is the reason, once your script is executed, if you close that connection, so that connections will be reduced and it will be faster. Okay. Now run the script. First name not matched, because in the database it is Anand and expected value I have given as test. Okay, so that's how we use database validation. Okay. So this is how normally we validate the database. Okay. So all this is the process, 7-step process it is. First you initiate the database connection, you define the connection string, and then you have to provide the connection string and you open it. You define the SQL query, you define the record set object, and then you have to open that record set object by specifying that query and the database, and then you retrieve the data, you validate it, and then once your validation is done, you close both record set and database. For every database, this process is common. Methods what we have used, common. Methods also will not be changed, but only thing what gets changed is connection string will get changed, SQL query will get changed, column names will get changed. That's it. Okay. So this is what we take from now, and next time, maybe once this is done, all concepts are completed, I will come back to the database again thoroughly, and I will explain all the SQL queries, including joins, everything that I will explain. And that time I will explain you detailed methods, the step-by-step process. What is cursor type, and then why we have to set for 3, why not 1? What methods will work when it is 3, what methods will not work when it is not 3, something like that. I will explain in detail whatever we have discussed. But this is only database validation, how the process will be when we are validating the database. Okay, just take that. Okay, alternative to the database checkpoint, this first step. Okay.